So now that we're authenticating our users on the client, they provide their Google credentials and we get this ID token, we want to authenticate them on the backend, on our server. And that means sending over this ID token to our server, checking to see if it's valid, getting the user's Google information there, and then when we execute a query from the client asking for the current user's information, we'll send it back from the server, upon which we'll store that information in our app and redirect them to the app component. So let's begin by, within our login component, taking this ID token and sending it to our backend when we execute the me query. We'll do that with the help of a lightweight GraphQL client library called GraphQL request. So we'll import GraphQL client from GraphQL request. GraphQL request is a great library to reach for when you want to execute a query or a mutation and you don't want to set up a library with a lot of boilerplate like Apollo. All you need to do to set up a GraphQL client here is a new GraphQL client, pass in the API endpoint. In our case, that's localhost 4000/GraphQL. So we'll be making the request there, and for the second argument, we pass in a config object where we can set our headers by setting it to an object where authorization has the value of our ID token. So now in order to make a request to execute a query or a mutation, we can get the return value from this instantiated GraphQL client in this client variable, and then we can just say client.request. And then in order to execute our me query with the request method, we can just head back to localhost 4000/playground, and we can take a look at our history to see when we executed the me query and select that, use it, and we can run it again to make sure it works properly, and then copy this entire query, head back to login, and then create a variable that this query is going to be stored in, and I'm going to call mine me_query. And we're going to put this query between a set of backticks, so it has to be provided as a string. But once we have that, we can pass in the me query to request, and request will return a promise. So we can make this an async function. We'll prefix the parameters with the async keyword, and then we can await client.request, and we can get back the result within a variable that we'll call data, and we can console log the data when it comes in. Now, although we're sending the ID token to our backend and we're executing this query, we haven't provided the functionality to actually do anything when this token comes in. So we need to intercept the request that's being made here, and we can do so by heading back to server.js, and we can add a new property to our instantiated Apollo server called context. Now, context can either be a function or an object. We're going to write it as a function, an arrow function, in order to grab the request that's being made from the parameters. We'll destructure request from the parameters of context, and now that allows us to get any headers that we're sending over. We're going to store this token that we're sending over on authorization in a new variable that we'll create called auth token, and we're going to initialize it with let and set it to null for now. We're going to reassign this later, which is why we're using let, and we're going to set up a try catch where we're going to try getting the ID token, the auth token as we're calling it here, from request.headers.authorization. We'll set that to auth token, and if that's not successful, we can just console error, unable to authenticate user with token, and then we can interpolate, if we're using template literals, the auth token that we got. But if we do have an auth token, and we can add a conditional within the try saying if auth token, if it's not a falsy value, then we can either find the user in our database according to this value if they already exist in our database, or we can create a user. So we're going to create a function that's going to first verify the token. Once it's verified, we'll get the Google user's information, and if that information is already in our database, we're just going to find them and return that user's data. Otherwise, we're going to create a new user and add it to our database. So we're going to add the functionality for this not within our resolvers file, but within a controller file. We want to keep our authentication logic separated from our resolvers. So we'll add a controller file to the controllers folder, and we'll call this usercontroller.js. We'll need a few things for this user controller. We're first going to need the user model, and that's to create new users and find existing users. That's going to come from /models/user. We'll also need the library that's going to enable us to verify the ID token, and for that we'll need OAuth2 client, and this is going to be from the library Google Auth library. Now we need to create this OAuth2 client. We can do that with new and pass into it our client ID. Remember that we added it to our .env file as OAuth client ID, so we can provide that as process.env.oauth client ID, and we get returned to us a client. Okay, so now we need to create a function which is going to contain the logic to find or create a new user. So we want to export with the exports object a new function called find or create user. It's going to accept a token, the auth token, and before we forget, let's require find or create user within server.js. And we can bring it in between a set of curly braces, find or create user from /controllers/user controller. And then we can execute it and pass it the auth token, like so. And then back in user controller, the first step will be to verify the auth token. The next will be to check if the user exists with the corresponding Google user information. Then if user exists, return it or return them. Otherwise, create new user in database. So we'll begin by creating a new function, and we'll just call it verify auth token. Now this will be an async function. We'll pass in the token to it, and we'll set up a try catch for some error handling. We're going to take the client that we created and await client.verify ID token, and this method will accept two things. It's going to accept the token itself on ID token, and it's also going to accept this audience value, to which we need to pass once again process.env.oauth client ID. And verify ID token returns a promise, so we can use await here, and we're going to put the result in a new variable called ticket, and if we have a ticket, we're going to return from it ticket.getPayload, which is a method, and this is going to return our Google user, very similar to what we were returned in onSuccess. And then in the catch we can say console.error, error verifying auth token, and then pass through the error itself. So we'll execute verify auth token, and since this is an async function, we need to await it and make find or create user an async function as well. So we'll await verify auth token, pass the token to it, and we get back our Google user. And before we forget, let's head back to server.js and make context an async await function as well, where we'll await find or create user there. So now we're getting back the Google user information. Then to check if the user exists, we'll create another function called check if user exists. And this is just going to take the email from Google user, which is a property of the object, and we'll see if we can find a user with the corresponding email in our database. So this will be an async function again. It's going to accept an email, and we'll await user.findOne, and for the filter we'll pass in the email that this function receives as both the property name and value. And then to have this return a promise, we'll use the exec method at the end. So then within find or create user, we'll await check if user exists, pass in Google user.email, and then we'll either have returned to us undefined or a user object within this user variable. And finally, we need to perform a check to see if the user exists in our database, and if not, we need to create a new user. So we'll use a ternary for this, where we're going to return user question mark, where if user is a truthy value, we have an object returned for our user. We found the user in our database, we'll just return it from find or create user. Otherwise, if we don't have a user, say user is undefined, we need to create them based on their Google user information. So we'll write a new function, create new user, which is going to take the Google user, and from the Google user object we get a bunch of information, but really we just want name, email, and picture, just like we've specified in our type defs for the user object type. So we'll grab name, email, and picture from Google user. Then we'll create a user object, which is just going to be the same values. And then we can say return new user. We use the user constructor to create a new user in our database, or rather a new user based off of our schema, pass in the user object, and then to persist this value to our database, we'll chain on the save method. So now we need to execute create new user, which is not an async function, passing in the entire Google user to it. Now back in server.js, since we have a value returned in find or create user, we're going to declare a new variable with let called current user and initialize it to null, and we'll reassign it when we get the current user information here after this is resolved. And then to make the current user available to our resolvers to execute a query conditionally based on whether we have a current user or not, after the try catch we will return in an object the current user. So if we head to our resolvers, we want to make sure before we execute this me query that we actually have a current user, and to throw an error if we don't have a current user, meaning the login was unsuccessful. So to add this logic, we'll create a new higher order function, which I'm going to call Authenticated. Authenticated is going to wrap our resolver functions, and it's going to, in the parameters of the first function, accept next, and in the next one accept the 4 parameters that every resolver function gets access to: root, which we won't be using in this app and we can ignore; args, short for arguments, meaning any arguments that were passed to a given query or mutation; ctx, or context. This is what context within New Apollo server is useful for. It's passing us current user in this case. And finally, info, which we don't need to be concerned with either. Then within the body of the function, we'll say if not context.currentUser, if there's no current user returned from our context function, then we're going to throw a new error, and this is a special type of error known as an authentication error. And we need to bring this in from the Apollo server package. Authentication error and require Apollo server. So this is for when things go wrong in the process of authenticating users, and we can pass a message to it of you must be logged in. Otherwise, if we do have a current user, we want to return next. Next is going to make it possible to execute the resolver function itself, and it's going to provide to that function all of the values, all of the parameters it normally gets access to: root, args, context, and info. So we'll wrap the me function with authenticated, and within me's parameters we get root, args, context, and from me we just want to return context.currentUser to get all of the current user data. So just to review everything that we did, in login we're asking for the current user data after we successfully log in and pass through the ID token from the login. We intercept the request that's being made within context. We take the ID token. We make sure that it's valid by verifying it. We get back that user's Google information. We take their email, check to see if they exist in our database. If they do, we just find them and return it. Otherwise, we create a new user. Either way, we return that user's information and provide it within the context parameter as current user. Then within our resolvers, we make sure that we have current user, otherwise we throw an error. And then finally, when we ask for it, when this query is resolved, we return current user from context. So let's save everything, and hopefully we don't get any errors. And if we test this out, we try logging in by going to /login. It looks like it was successful. We're getting back something in our data object. So on data we have me, and then in me we get all the fields we asked for: _ID, picture, name, and email. And all of this data is coming from Google. The ID was automatically generated by our database, and this can be confirmed if we head back to MongoDB Atlas. You may need to log in again. But if we take a look in our Explorer at collections, in our users collection that was created, we should have one document with all of the info that was just returned from our backend.